Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cipher Brief's virtual studio. And thank you for joining us for today's conversation on the global race for AI and the national security interest tied to exporting cutting-edge technology. The U.S. is currently at a crossroads. On one hand, American tech companies are striking lucrative deals to sell advanced AI chips to partners in the Gulf, while on the other, lawmakers and security experts are sounding the alarm over potential leaks to adversaries like China and Russia. Questions about guardrails, export controls, and strategic leadership in AI have never been more urgent. And joining us for this important discussion is Janet Egan. She is currently a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, where she leads research on the national security implications of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. Janet, thank you so much for joining us for this important and timely discussion. As someone who is completely immersed in this world, tell me, what concerns you the most about the recent U.S. AI tech deals with Gulf states?
Thanks, Alison, and thanks for having me. Something that concerns me, and I think it needs to be worked out over time, is what security measures are being put in place to safeguard US interests with these deals. So to take a step back, AI chips are more than just any other kind of technology. Experts and policymakers broadly agree that AI has potential significant dual-use capabilities, and that's why we've been having export controls on them to date, why there's been so much competition with China to ensure the US stays ahead. To date, the US has been the clear leader in AI, both in terms of models, but perhaps more importantly, in terms of having the computational resources, the massive data centers filled with thousands and thousands of chips, really specialized chips and hardware that enables advanced AI training, refinement, and then deployment. And so what we're starting to see now is that the US build-out is starting to stall. And that's because of domestic energy constraints, permitting and regulations, and just access to energy and the ability to build out massive data centers with energy infrastructure to support them. Now, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are non-democratic countries. They don't have the same constraints when it comes to regulatory review, permitting review, environmental protections, and they're able to override legislation overnight if they need to achieve their national interests. And so when I see these really large deals of massive amounts of chips and computational resources going to countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, my first question is, hang on, how are we ensuring that the US maintains lead in this space in terms of having the greatest capabilities? And then the second one is, how are we ensuring that these chips aren't diverted to other countries of concern? In particular, just to touch on that, China is both the largest trading partner of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And I think we should make sure we're considering these deals in that broader context.
Absolutely. And I've heard several talking heads, on our mainstream media talk about these backdoor access that China could have. How credible do you think those fears are that China could obtain this technology through those backdoor methods?
So I think there's two potential ways that China could gain access to these technologies through these deals. The first is not having proper due diligence on ensuring that the chips that are sent to these countries stay in these countries. So we're talking about export diversion and chip smuggling to China. And so a lot of folk have been talking about that as a main issue. Now, that can actually be pretty well managed with things like inspections and safeguards, and potentially even new technologies on the chips themselves that allow for geolocation tracking of the chips, so you can tell if it leaves the designated country. But I think another more concerning way that China could get access to such capabilities is through the cloud. So essentially, you don't actually need to own the chips and the massive data centers to use them and to benefit from them. Now, it's probably fine for China to be using up to certain amounts of this compute, because at the end of the day, we're really just concerned about these dual use capabilities that China can't already get access to. And that is the massive amounts of chips used for train these frontier or large language models that are really driving forward capabilities. And that's where you need to have much greater due diligence, both in terms of who's using the chips. Are they using them through a shell company? How can we ensure that this isn't actually a CCP-linked actor using these massive data centers to do things for nefarious purposes?
The battlefield has changed. It's no longer just boots on the ground. It's code, cloud, and quantum. On June 5th and 6th in Austin, Texas, the Cipher Brief presents NatSec Edge, where national security meets the leading edge of innovation. From AI-driven warfare to open-source intelligence, quantum-secure comms to the race for critical minerals. This is where the threats are real, the tools are evolving, and the mission is clear. Join the leaders shaping tomorrow's battlefield today. Be at the edge. Reserve your seat at natsekedge.com.
In your opinion, what kind of guardrails would be necessary to protect our interests in that space?
Yeah, so I think the first one is looking at know your customer regimes. And it can't just be an on-paper regime. So we do this in the banking sector to say you need to understand who your customers are so that if there's large amounts of money changing hands, you can quickly identify money laundering and terrorism financing and put a stop to that. Now, in the compute space, we don't actually have any obligations at the moment, even in the US, to understand to a great level of depth who customers are using a lot of the compute. And in the US space, you've got good, I think fairly good engagement between the hyperscalers and the government. And often you get that information as part of your due diligence in your business to understand who are these customers. They're spending a lot of money. You need to understand who they are. But once you outsource those obligations to another country, that's much harder to ensure that they're being done correctly. I think also the risk of shell companies adds more complexity. Even on the chip smuggling side, we've seen TSMC, the chip fabricator, the largest chip manufacturer, that are making these AI chips, actually send a lot of them to Huawei through the use of a shell company. And they just said, well, it didn't say it was Huawei. It was much more complex, but they essentially didn't do deeper due diligence to ensure that this company was legitimate. And so that's a lot harder to enforce, to say, are you actually going deep enough to make sure that this is not a transaction of concern? So going forward with these deals, I think there's a lot of detail that we don't yet know and potentially a lot of detail being worked out. And I'm interested to see, is it US hyperscalers that are going to own and operate most of these chips in the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Or is it companies from these countries? And if so, what is the level of engagement between US companies and governments and their respective counterparts there?
Absolutely. We are in the early stages of these deals, so there are a lot of unknowns at this time. I know that at least supporters of these deals argue that despite the concerns about China, these moves are actually necessary in order to expand American influence and outflank China in the global AI race. Do you think if the proper guardrails are put in place and the due diligence is done, that these deals can serve both strategic and economic goals without compromising our security?
I think it is going to be very difficult, but not impossible, to get sufficient guardrails that are sufficiently enforced. But it will take dedicated effort and attention. Just for context, the previous deal between G42 and Microsoft for a much smaller amount of chips took, I think, approximately a year in negotiations in terms of getting those safeguards in place. And so I think this is not a small effort, and the US government needs to be willing to put a lot of resources and attention into this space to ensure success. I am sympathetic to the point that you can't just say none of the rest of the world can have US technology. It does make sense for the US to be the partner of choice, particularly in compute, which is physical and sticky infrastructure that people are less likely to just jump ship to move away from. And so that's where I think it's really important we do see exports happening. But you just want to be doing it in a way that I think personally you want to ensure that the US maintains the lead in terms of the largest data centers in the world, because that's where we're most likely to see new emerging capabilities that could have big national security implications. And then below that, how can you ensure that there's strong US engagement to ensure that these companies and countries stay on side with the US? So it's good to bring them in further into the orbit. These are pretty large deals, and so that means there's even more importance on having safeguards.
And we've talked about how the US does have that limited domestic energy capacity for these massive AI centers. And I do think that stateside that is being worked on. But in the meantime, these deals are being cut with other countries that have more of that capacity. I know that something that's on the minds of a lot of people with the UAE in particular is that it's an authoritarian regime. Should we be concerned about giving transformative AI technologies over to countries like that? And should democracy be a prereq for cutting a deal with a country in terms of AI?
Really great questions. I think it's very hard to say democracy has to be a prerequisite because the people you're making deals with are not going to sign up to that. And I think it's important to not take a binary approach of are you democratic, are you not, but actually look at the incentives and the interests and where interests align and differ, and to take that approach. I think we should be bringing more countries on board with transformative capabilities, but I think there's a lot more work to do in terms of AI applications that we can partner on with other countries. So looking at applications of AI for government services or in the healthcare industry. And to date, I think the US has been so focused on progressing the frontier. There's been an underinvestment in practical use cases. And a lot of other countries are less interested in the frontier and are very eager to do more practical implications of AI. So I think that's an underexplored area of how to promote the US as a trusted technology partner and reduce demand for like alternate supply chains as well.
Would that include more investment per se in like American AI companies?
I think American AI companies have a lot of investment right now, but they're incentivized to take any given level of capability and then spend that to actually try and push the capability level forward rather than to diffuse that across the economy. So I think it's more done in partnership between government and the private sector, and also with some of the export financing arrangements or the DFC's support to actually get these technologies promoted as trusted offerings in other countries.
And just going back to the US government here and how it plays into what we're dealing with now, given the scale and the pace of these deals that we're seeing come out in recent days, do you think that there has been sufficient congressional oversight? And also, what do you think about the public transparency of these deals?
On the latter part of the question, I think a lot of diplomacy has to happen within sort of trusted communication circles to enable countries to come, frankly, to the table and to nut out the details. And so I think only time will tell as to whether the processes are happening and there's enough attention and rigor around these processes. But just to put it in some context, I think Konstantin Pilz from RAND did some great analysis in terms of what the potential of this deal could look like. And so if we think about the flagship US data center or compute builder at the moment called Stargate, by 2028, we're looking at about 4.5 gigawatts of energy and up to approximately 2.25 million of the most advanced chips. And then we compare it to the announcements recently, and in the UAE, we're looking up to 5 gigawatts, which, to put it in context, that's 5 nuclear reactors worth of energy, supported running into about 2.5 million chips. So even if these are rolled out as is, there is a risk that the UAE has more chips for a single AI training run than the US. But where the details really come in is like what proportion of those are controlled by different players in the market, or what proportion are controlled by US companies overseas, which I think there's greater insurance that they follow proper process and due diligence.
And when you look at it from that lens, you can see why these data centers overseas would seem lucrative, because they're just so much greater than what we currently have, even up until 2028 here in the United States. In your opinion, do you think that the limited domestic energy capacity that we have here in the US for these massive data centers, do you think it's a legitimate reason for us to be outsourcing critical infrastructure like that?
I want to see energy reform because I think I would like to see the US as the democratic tech leader of the world making more things here. But that being said, there's much broader benefits to energy reform too. And I think that the US shouldn't miss out on an opportunity to like enhance the system, get rid of roadblocks, and enable, more cheap, reliable, and efficient energy for the entire population. So I think this is a call to action for the US to think clearly about what more it can do on the energy front. The Trump administration has taken a range of actions through executive orders that actually do look to unlock further, remove some of the permitting barriers. But at the end of the day, it's a really litigious environment. So action by Congress would be really welcome in this space.
And like you said, a lot of details still yet to emerge. So something to keep watch on. Janet, anything else that you want to add that I didn't ask, or you think that people should know about this?
Yeah, I think I hear a lot about a lot of concern about, oh, we need to do these deals as soon as possible and say yes to a lot of conditions because otherwise they'll turn to China. And I wanted to take a moment to unravel that assumption briefly,
Absolutely.
because I think if we look at analysis and where the US sits vis-a-vis China on AI chips, the US is probably about 4 years ahead in performance. And then if we look globally at the data centers, again, at the moment, I think there's very limited use of Chinese chips outside of China. And even the leading Chinese AI firms are using US chips. And so there's a lot of speculation of, oh, if we don't agree ASAP, or if we don't say yes to these conditions, maybe they'll just turn to China. But at the end of the day, China is not yet there. We have time. We have years ahead of China. We can't afford to be complacent, but we should be making sure that we're taking the time to do these deals well and ensure they represent US interests to the maximum extent possible.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. I know that I've heard that position several times about, if we don't do this deal, China's going to, get ahead of us in this sort of AI race. So it's interesting to hear, your commentary about how actually right now we're ahead. 4 years, like I said, we can't be complacent, but we're still ahead of the game as it stands now.
And so I think we need to be doing clever partnerships, clever diffusion of this technology, but making sure that it still supports the US advantage.
In your opinion, what would be a clever partnership? What would be a good partnership for the US to engage in right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be done at below frontier levels of AI. So when we talk about the frontier, it's the largest data centers with the most chips. And I think there's a lot of room to actually partner with countries like the UAE that are capital rich and resource rich and have really strong links in the global south. So UAE in Africa in particular has already built a lot of infrastructure there, and doing that in partnership together, I think could bring AI and compute access to a much broader pool of people, a lot more nations, while at the same time keeping the US in partnership with the UAE and bolstering those connections, while not really focusing on really pushing out that frontier of training to the point where it might compete with US.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking your time all the way from Australia to join us, and we will see you next time.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.